project. So we have some findings at this stage, and presenting those findings to us is the Deputy Director of Programs for CTH, Clean Tech Hub, Mr. Abel Gaya. Mr. Abel Gaya, sir, are you ready? Please welcome him. Please welcome him to the table. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Miracle. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We at Clean Technology Hub have been undertaking some of the research work under this broader project, and as Ms. Serwa and Ms. Ife had mentioned, we'll be presenting findings from a particular section of that research. So this presentation is particularly on our view of the policies that the Nigerian government, through various ministries, has instituted or launched over the past few years on various of the intersections of mini-grids, renewable energy, youths, and employment. So these are, many of these policies have been created by the Ministry of Power, Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Youth, and even more integrated policies that have a more widespread interministerial coordination. So what I'll be taking you through is an assessment of the problem, and we'll go into the modularities of the research and how we undertook it, and then we'll delve into some of the policies which won't take too long. So we don't want to bore you with details on clauses and all that. Next slide, please. Apologies for the technical difficulties. So right now, what we have as a major problem in Africa is that the continent is expected to have one of the largest populations globally by 2050. And the continent is at the same time the youngest. So the percentage of people aged up to 24 years is the largest. And the absolute number, in terms of the absolute number as well, is the largest in the world. And is projected to, so in percentage terms, but in absolute terms, expected to be the largest by 2050. And a lot of them are unemployed. So we have a large unemployment, youth unemployment problem, particularly across various African countries. So when you hear in Nigeria of out-of-school children, we also have the largest out-of-school child population as well. So in addition to that problem, you then have the problem of youths who go into universities, who go into polytechnics, who go into colleges of education. And when they graduate, you have, even before they go into school, you will see a lot of youths waiting to write JAM, waiting to get into university, and have to wait another year in order to get there. And so as they are waiting, you have others who are in school, and they come out of school looking for jobs. Many enter NYSC, then pass through NYSC, and many people are looking for jobs. Some just start their own business, go into the informal sector. They do fashion designing, or tailoring, and some other businesses. For those who are fortunate, they are able to scale and start up more sustainable businesses, and are able to grow their businesses. But for a large number of youths, there is a lot of unemployment and discouragement. So that means they've been looking for jobs for a long time, and at the end of it all, they give up looking for jobs and either go into disguised unemployment or go into levels of dependency or into the informal sector that is not covered by statistics. And so out of what we have as people joining the labor force, what is generated in terms of jobs is grossly inadequate, which means that we have to create a larger number of jobs in order to meet this labor demand across Africa and across Nigeria. Next, please. So, as part of APRI's and CTH's efforts to solve this problem, as Serwa had mentioned, there was a continental scoping report, and now we're going into country case studies. So these were the focus countries and focus sectors that were chosen. Nigeria, because it is the second largest potential mini-grid markets in Africa, and the largest in West Africa. And the mini-grid sector has a large revenue potential, but also a significant youth employment opportunity to be exploited. And there were also reasons for choosing Kenya. Kenya is one of the most advanced, if not the most advanced, in the e-mobility sector in East Africa. And Ghana is usually ranked among the top third in Africa when it comes to climate-smart agri-tech, climate-smart agricultural technologies. So this was the reason for selecting these countries and these focus sectors. Next, please. So I know we are all in the renewable energy sector, most of us, but just to standardize understanding of the technology itself, if you've heard of, we all know what a solar system is, what a solar panel is. So if you look on the roofs of many houses or many buildings, you will see solar panels. But a solar mini-grid particularly is for electrifying many households or many buildings at the same time. So if you have a community, for example, of like 100 buildings or 100 households, up to 500 households, 1,000 households, a mini-grid system would be able to you have your solar panels, you have batteries, you have your powerhouse, you have your distribution cables that supply electricity powered by the sun, by solar irradiation that then feed into the inverter system and all the relevant technologies, and then transmit electricity into the households that are connected to that mini-grid. So it is called a mini-grid because it is less than 1 megawatt power in terms of installed capacity. And so that is the classification within Nigeria. In some other countries, it's up to like 5 megawatts or 10 megawatts. But in Nigeria, it's as long as it is below 1 megawatt, it is called a mini-grid. Just as we have a national grid that supplies power to all the entire on-grid population, we have a mini-grid. Next, please. And so this just gives you further detail about the context within the country that we are operating. So there is a large percentage of people who are young. So young people make up a significant percentage of the population in the country, about around 40%. But there's also a large youth unemployment problem. NBS, Nigerian Bureau of Statistics, estimation is at 8%, but when you take into account unemployed people, discouraged workers, that goes up to 20-something percent. Actually, that is for general unemployment. Youth unemployment tends to be around 50-something, 52% or so, both in Nigeria and in many other countries. And a lot of people, as I mentioned, go into self-employment. So a large percent of the workers that are employed are actually employed as, they rate themselves as self-employed. So they own their businesses and they employ, either employ labor or they are the only, let's say, labor in their organizations. And most of these are in the informal sector. As you well know, most of the companies and a large percentage of the GDP in Nigeria is contributed to by SMEs, MSMEs, and most of these are in the informal sector. And there's a large working poverty rate. That means people who are employed, who are working, but are under the poverty, within the band of poverty figures. And at the same time, we have about 90 million people who lack access to electricity. So these are people that are not connected to the grid, to the national grid, and do not have access to electricity. But estimates around how many people need mini-grids as the least cost electrification method vary, but at a minimum, it's about 6,000 mini-grids that are needed to electrify about 27% of population clusters across Nigeria. And so these mini-grids, this means that, so within Nigeria, it's an integrated energy planning approach where a significant percentage of those 91 million, about 30%, the least cost electrification method for them is extending the national grid. So extending transmission lines, extending distribution lines, and putting in transformers and substations and all that. Another almost third, about 27%, it's mini grids that is the least cost electric. Those are the ones that are more than 5 kilometers away from the nearest transmission line. And you have solar home systems, which are the next option for those in very sparsely distributed clusters. But mini grids also have a significant employment impact. Estimates from the African Mini Grid Developers Association shows that the per kilowatts of a mini grid installed creates about 0.14 to 0.16 jobs, which means that if you install a 20 kilowatt system, about 3 to 4 jobs can come out of it. So typically these jobs include, say, security guards, the vendor that's through which the community members can procure, can purchase electricity, the technician that works at the powerhouse in the community, and so on. And these jobs also increase if this doesn't include part-time jobs like when the mini grid is being installed, those who work on the installation, the construction of the powerhouse and all that. But it also includes indirect jobs that are created when the mini grid also comes with productive use interventions. So interventions that bring in technologies that can be used for agro-processing, for barbing salons and all that increase electricity and allow more workers to be employed by micro and SMEs in the community. Next, please. So based on this broader view and this context, we have 3 key research questions that we're looking at. So, what extent or what are the current policy tools and policies and regulatory frameworks that's within the mini-grid sector, the solar mini-grid sector, and the youth employment, and for youth employment in Nigeria. So what are these first? And then how coherent are these policies and tools with each other? So to what extent are we looking at a high level of coherence which reflects the degree of coordination and cogency within these multiple ecosystems? So how do these ecosystems of creation of policies for youth employment, for employment for youths, for solar mini-grids, how do they interact and intersect? And lastly, do the tools and rules promote green jobs for youths in the sector? So after looking at what the policies are, how coherent they are, we then look at whether they promote green jobs for youths. Next, please. So we took a look into or assessed 6 different policy documents in these areas: renewable energy, employment, and youth and national development. So some of these policies are within a policy domain. So a youth policy, an employment policy, a renewable energy policy, and an integrated national development policy. So 3 domains, those, and then a multi-sectoral domain, which is the integrated national development policy. And we focus on national policies because at the moment within Nigeria, many of the policies related to renewable energy are housed at the central government level. I think Delta State was the first to have a climate change policy in 2013, but only had 2 pages of talking about renewable energy. But most states till now do not have renewable energy policies, except a few, about 6 or 7 of them out of 36 states. And it's also easier, the difficulty in accessing state-level policies is also a major factor. So you often have to go to the states themselves and ask from their ministries of energy or whatever, who have hard copies of these documents. So they do not scan them and put them online typically. Next, please. So these are the key policies that were identified. And this just gives you a brief summary, which is why I said we won't go in depth into the specific clauses, but this, So this gives you a summary of the policy itself, the ministry that was responsible for its development, the extent to which the policy has a general flair of climate action, climate change or sustainability, environmental sustainability, the extent to which the policy mentions mini-grids, solar mini-grids, or even in some cases broader renewable energy particularly for off-grid applications, and then the extent to which the policy talks about youths and talks particularly about youths. Yeah. So beginning with the renewable energy master plan. So this is a fairly old policy document developed by the Ministry of Power. And if you, generally the Ministry of Power policy documents, including the NREEP, the National Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency Policy, has a lot to do with talking about renewable energy more broadly. So you see a lot of content about the need for renewable energy, the benefits, the specific targets even for renewable energy. So you see policies, the 30-30-30, for example, targets of 30% of renewable energy in the energy mix by 2030. And of course, you'll also see applications of various types of technologies in those policies, including solar mini-grids, solar mini-grid technologies. But even though they are broad and generalized and generic mentions of employment impacts or productive impacts of these renewable energy technologies, there tends to be little to no mention particularly of youths. So there are no specific provisions in many of these policies particularly for youth employment to be impacted. So there's a general view of national applicability, national development without disaggregation by demography. So this applies to both policies. The off-grid electrification strategy also, which was developed by the Rural Electrification Agency, but the REA is also under the Ministry of Power. And although in the REA's plans, for example, in the Rural Electrification Strategy and Implementation Plan, which was also developed by the Ministry of Power, but specifically to be implemented by the REA, they are in rural areas. So when the REA talks about electricity for rural areas, there tends to be a stronger emphasis on rural development than the Ministry of Power when it focuses on the national level. So because of this, you also see more allusions to youth employment, and even in its programs, energizing education, for example, and its initiatives where there is a lot of training of youths for different installations that they have. You also have, sorry, that was supposed to be the national economic sustainability policy developed by the Economic Sustainability Committee, which was an interministerial committee headed by the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Budget and National Planning at the time. You will notice both in Nigeria and in Kenya and Ghana, you will see the tendency for integrated national plans to have more focus on these three areas. So this policy, the economic sustainability policy, which came out, I think in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, I was looking at charting the way forward in terms of national rejuvenation after the pandemic, had a lot of talk about climate action, about sustainability, and mentioned the role of mini-grids in providing electricity, for example, to, what do they call them, isolation centers and health centers and all that. But also had substantive mentions of youths and the need to include youth in the policies, in the plans and initiatives that it was proposing. You have the Ministry of Labor's National Employment Policy, which in comparison to Ghana and I think Kenya also has so in comparison to Ghana and Kenya, Nigeria's National Employment Policy also has or scores better in terms of its coverage of these three areas. And we'll have to commend the Ministry of Labor for that. But it does not go into detail about the youth contents, particularly at the nexus of mini-grids. But it does speak to general means of addressing youth employment, which is applicable to the mini-grid sector. So, and many of these, when they mention youth employment, the tools, the policy tools that are mentioned or addressed tend to be capacity building, training programs, and where it mentions startups that are so micro enterprises that are led by youths, for example. It also includes credit facilities and fiscal incentives for these startups. And lastly, the National Youth Policy unfortunately ranks, I think, the poorest here. So the sustainability and climate action content is relatively low. Also the content on renewable energy, low, but of course, as a youth policy, there is a lot of youth employment mentioned in there. So what you have generally tends to be the case that, next slide please, the case that not all ministries have sustainability and climate action as part of their focus. And you see that reflected in, when you look at the policy documents developed by other ministries, whether Ministry of Health, Education, and so on, you'll see that there tends to be a siloed approach where many ministries think climate action talk is the job of the Ministry of Environment, or is the job of the REA, or whatever the case, while they focus on their core work. Where, and then the Ministry of, say, Power thinks that the job of youth employment is the job of the Ministry of Labor, for example. And so you see that limits bureaucratic coordination, so coordination between different ministries in developing policies and initiating and having initiatives, joint initiatives. And one of the goals of the National Council on Climate Change, created under the National Climate Change Act, was to foster a greater level of universal focus or universal inclusion of climate action across all the ministries in Nigeria. So I think one of the provisions of the act was that each ministry should have a climate change desk, if I'm not mistaken. Some ministries have climate change officers and so on, but it is not always that if there is an interministerial committee, for example, that you have representatives from each ministry that are very aware of the need for climate action in the respective policy and what they advocate when they are there. At the same time, you have at the private sector level a disparity in the extent of youth presence and youth inclusion in the policy making process. So one of the research pieces of research that we did was to look at the ages of CEOs in each of these sectors in each of these countries. Can anyone guess for which country and which sector there were CEOs with the highest average ages? So in which country and which sector did you have the oldest CEOs on average? Can anyone guess here? No? No guess is wrong. Okay, guess is maybe wrong, but don't be discouraged. Anyone? No? Nigeria. Give her a round of applause. So Nigeria by far had and this was a substantial margin, where the ages of the average age of the CEO, the average CEO in the Nigerian mini-grid sector tends to be higher than those in e-mobility and the climate smart agriculture tech sector. And part of the reason is that, first, you know that compared to these sectors, you have a higher capital or higher. So to install a mini grid, you need a higher capital outlay than you need to, for example, create your first electric tricycle or electric motorcycle prototype. And the same in the climate smart agri-tech sector. If you are doing work on let's say an app, you are building an app that connects farmers and whatever. Or so many of the innovations in the climate smart agri-tech sector tends to be digital solutions. So there tends to be lower capital requirements for those types of, to deploy your first prototype or your first product than in the mini-grid sector. And many of those in the mini-grid sector, also in terms of STEM educational backgrounds of the CEOs, the mini-grid sector has a higher percentage of CEOs that have science, engineering backgrounds than in the e-mobility and in the climate smart ag-tech sector. So that limits the extent to which you see leaders who are youths in the Nigerian mini-grid sector compared to the two other sectors and the two other countries. And even when you have youths at the table, and this is the observation across the board in all countries, even when you have youths at the table, it does not mean that when they are invited to policy development subcommittees or committees, it does not mean that they stress the need for youth inclusion in the policies. There tends to be an endogeneity in this case where those sectors that have youths as leaders of the companies in those sectors and that are invited to policy drafting subcommittees or committees to represent the private sector, they may not advocate for youth inclusion, explicit youth inclusion in these policies because they are already benefiting. So whatever the general policy application is, they as youth leaders in those subsectors benefit from that. Whereas in those sectors that you have low youth presence as leaders, you don't have as much engagement of youth in these policy making processes. So there's a reinforcement of the pre-existing demographic power structure where those that are youths are the ones invited in those sectors that are youth-led, and those that are youths in the sectors that are not youth-led are not invited. So we need processes and institutional mechanisms that allow even those in those sectors that are not youth-led to be able to feed into the policy-making process, which is why it is important. And many renewable energy associations across these countries typically don't have youth wings, for example, that can help feed into that process. Next. So what you have, or just before that, what you have is that these factors, both at the bureaucratic level and then at the private sector level, contribute to low levels of policy coherence in these policies when it comes to mini-grids, youth employment, and youth focus. Next, please. And finally, okay, not finally, there's another, yeah. So that was the conclusion I just made, that even though the median age in these three countries tends to be around 20, 22 or so, I think in Nigeria it's closer to 19 or so. There is a education that policies have in order to have Africa solve its youth employment problem. So as we are looking forward to an energy transition, a green transition, climate action and net zero, these structural factors and the institutional deficits when it comes to youth inclusion that we have at the end of 2050, 2060 for Nigeria that is looking at net zero by 2060, we may have the same status quo of high youth unemployment that we currently have if we do not change these things. Next, please. And these are just a few of the recommendations that we can propose and that we can pursue if we want to start changing this situation. So, for example, the Renewable Energy Association of Nigeria should have a youth wing that's so that when it is representing private sector interests within policy drafting committees or within policy validation meetings or another policy design mechanisms, youth presence is acknowledged. And we need to systematize it just as we have successfully, based on how you look at it, systematized gender mainstreaming. So there is a lot of, all these policy documents, you will see gender mainstreaming in them because of a lot of donor effort, a lot of on-the-ground grassroots movements by women to mainstream gender and have an explicit focus on how they are going to mainstream gender in the policies and the implementation. So in the same way, we'll need to have youth mainstreaming in this. And yeah, creation of national councils on green technologies. So this means that the NCCC should intensify its efforts in undertaking bureaucratic greening across the ministries in the country. And yeah, those are the key recommendations, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we give him one more time a round of applause? Mr. Abel Kaya, Deputy Director, Clean Technology Hub. So, as you can see from that report, there is a lot to be done. There's a lot that needs to be done. So while we're gathering, doing our research and trying to gather as much insight as we can gather, we'll be needing your help now. So this section is dedicated to question and answers from yourselves based on all of this reporting and all of these that we've said. If anyone here has a question, you can please indicate so we come to you and then provide as much answers as we can, or just take it. Thank you very much. Meanwhile, to keep up with updates for not just this research but other work that CleanTech is into, please do want to follow us on social media across all major social media platforms, CleanTech Hub or CleanTech Hub Nigeria. You will find us there, and also the African Policy Research Institute as well. Please do want to follow us just for updates as the case may be. Sir, please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Kelvin Johnson Chu. I introduced myself earlier. I'm a software engineer in the power industry.
Thank you.
Okay, so my question goes to the last gentleman who addressed us. It's more like I'm still forming my thoughts about the reports and everything, but I would just like to first of all commend the work that's gone so far into research and trying to discover what the policy drive is in our country for the enablement of, or rather the employment of youth, right? It's a really big problem. But I'm trying to think through the sort of drive to kind of get them involved in perhaps the training of the installations, and to also get them more involved in also trying to appreciate the problem of power and energy, and then using that to kind of drive their involvement as well, like reaching out more to them and seeing how they can get more interested in not just as a means of employment, but kind of like the double-edged sword approach of, yes, you're going to be able to get something in your pocket by doing something, but also you're solving a wider problem. So I guess what my thought is like trying to forge that approach.
When you make policies, we now talk of practicability aspect of it. Now, as at today, as a food processor, I can't really afford this, particularly when you talk of solar, because the gadgets I use require lots of power. And then